Simon Tolhurst, welcome to the show.
Hi, Joe. Thank you very much for having me.
What is it about art that draws you in? Because perhaps rather pretentiously, I've often thought that when I retire, like Churchill, I'd like to go to the French Riviera and paint and, live out the rest of my days in that fashion, but maybe not right now. And then I was thinking, well, why is that? And I think it would mostly be because it just takes so much time and process. There's no hacks when it comes to art. You just have to just sit there and go through the process. So what is it about it that encapsulates you?
I think, you can obviously come at the subject of art from very different levels. You can be an enthusiast who enjoys attending exhibitions and looking at the work of other artists and has, sort of a part-time or a hobbyist look at the actual practice of making images, drawings, and paintings. And then the deeper you can get into it, it's obviously an endless depth to this that you can get more and more caught up in it. And it's a practice discipline. So that means that the more that you do it, the more that you develop your skills, you develop your understanding, and also you develop your curiosity to sort of follow that, the way that you expand your creativity, and to do that through your work. So for me personally, I certainly became very enveloped in that whole idea of looking and changing the way that I look through the work that I do, and then trying to use that work to connect with the rest of the world, with other people.
Your medium per se is drawing, and a lot of your subjects are people. Why did you choose people instead of, say, like the British landscape?
Well, I'd love to try some landscapes at the moment, but I'm very studio based, and also I live central London, and most of the landscape within easy reach is quite manicured. There's always a house somewhere in the background, and sort of like to go to somewhere truly wild and try and tackle the landscape is something that I've got ambitions to do at some point. So basically, with my practice, I like to involve other people in it. I like to have people as a subject, and so I end up doing a lot of portraits of people because that's the easiest way to engage someone in what I'm doing. And it's very personal as well. It's people that I meet in various ways and connect with in various ways who then I can ask, would you sit for me? And at the beginning, it can be a short drawing, and then if the person enjoys the pose or the activity of posing, which in itself can be a nice activity, relaxing and meditative. Um, and also seeing someone else's view of you at the end of it in a different way to a photograph. And I think that leads on to having a lot of people in my artwork. I also make other images. I make still life. I like still life as a genre. If I don't have anybody to pose for me, then setting up a still life painting with a mix of different objects within it can be a really interesting subject to tackle. And there's a rich art history in that genre. And also self-portraiture, where you kind of draw and paint from a mirror. And I think my primary media is really painting, but drawing is much more, very much more immediate. You can get a finished drawing in a short space of time, whereas a painting requires quite a lot of time layering that paint and sort of going back to the image and comparing what you've got against the real life and making changes and updates and more details. And of course, the further you get through it, the more time you spend on an image, the more you can get to parts of the image and details of the subject that you wouldn't possibly get to in a shorter sketch or a shorter drawing. And then that challenges your technique with whatever material you're using to try and respond to that detail that you've managed to make it to, because you've extended the length of time that you're working on that particular image. I'm very keen on using a lot of time in an image to really kind of push forward and get to those points of the edge of my normal ability, normal stretch of time working on a piece, and to go beyond it, because then you're into new territory. And I think that every minute you spend in that new territory is worth 5 minutes of the normal part that you do in every drawing and painting. It's getting to those new extremes and trying to push your technique with the material and to respond to something new.
I didn't realize, or I didn't know, and perhaps this is ignorance on my behalf, that hospitals had resident portrait artists. And this is a process in which you sort of came to acclaim for on the national news. How did that process about becoming a resident portrait artist come about?
Well, I think hospitals have resident artists quite often. There's a very established link between creativity and well-being. And so, artists in residence in hospital settings has been quite a long-standing thing. For me personally, I was invited by a charity at the hospital called Haematology Cancer Care, which um, they had a volunteer that had a background in arts administration, and so they proposed having some arts projects and activities, and that's how I came to be invited. And I thought myself, I've not spent much time in hospital settings, much less a cancer hospital setting. And so, we came along, we had some meetings, I had a look at the environment, and actually we trialed it initially in 2013. I came in as a trial, but it very quickly became apparent the reaction from patients and their loved ones and the staff was really positive, that the patient quite enjoyed the activity of posing because it's not very strenuous. It takes their mind off their treatment. It helps to pass a long appointment, and it produces an image at the end. And people sometimes said, "Oh, I thought only rich and famous people had their portraits done." So it seemed like a bit of a treat coming unexpectedly almost out of the situation where they're having treatment. And it just snowballed from there. So then we formalized it with the charity, and yes, I've been going one afternoon per week pretty much ever since. And we celebrated 10 years in 2023 in August. And yeah, it's just there's a nice demand for it in the hospital.
What's the process that you go through when sitting down with someone? Because I suspect it initially, you'll be very experienced at it now, but initially it must be quite odd, especially with patients going through the treatment that they are. How do you get yourself in the right headspace, but also make sure that the patient feels at ease?
I think that's key, that the patient feels at ease. It's also key that as the artist, I'm always understanding that their treatment is much more important. It's why they're there. They're not there to pose for me necessarily. So I've got to, and I have a leaflet that describes the project, and sometimes people have seen me there drawing previously because it's quite an open plan space in the daycare area of the hospital. And um, there's also some leaflets and posters, so people can either get in touch with me and ask if they would like to have a portrait made, or if I don't have somebody booked, I can approach people in the daycare area. And as you said, so making them feel at ease as soon as possible, and offering the opportunity, offering the possibility. And if they don't want a portrait done, that's completely understandable. And then you're just someone to chat to for a few minutes about a different subject, and before sort of moving on and finding someone who maybe is that day thinking, what, actually, I'd quite like to try this. And the nice thing about the project as well is that everybody receives signed prints of their drawing, so they get multiple copies, which is then possible to give to friends and family. And it's very difficult to get a sympathetic image of your loved one in a hospital setting like that, because you take a photograph and it takes in all of the equipment and environment, and if the patient is feeling a little bit off color because of the chemo, then it picks that up too. Whereas a pencil on paper drawing, it's very much concerned with the shape and face of the shape and size of the face and the features, and getting that likeness. And I think the material suits the situation as well. I mean, it's a clinical setting, so it needs to be, whatever I'm using needs to be low impact, and it's also a predictable length of time to get the right outcome with a pencil drawing. That I know that with a pencil drawing I can get a likeness, sort of within an hour and 15 minutes, something like that.
How do you balance maintaining a conversation with the patient whilst also drawing. Because if I have a conversation with someone whilst I'm unloading the dishwasher, I just stop unloading the dishwasher because my ability to multitask like that is so finite. So it must be an absolute nightmare, or by your third thousand portrait, you're pretty much a pro at it.
I think that, we are able to automate what we're doing sometimes. I think, very early on in the project, I met a lady and I asked her about a portrait, and she said, "Can I knit whilst you draw me?" And I said, "Well, can you look at me whilst you're knitting? Because I like to get that connection in the portraits that I do, both at the hospital and generally in my practice. I like the person to be looking back at the viewer of the image, of the drawing or the painting." And she said, "Yes, oh, of course, yes." And she was a very experienced knitter, and she was able to knit away whilst we chatted, and I made the drawing. And I think there's something in our evolution that's still there from, when we had to forage whilst looking out for predators. Our brain automates those difficult tasks, and it frees up your consciousness to be sort of able to pay attention to other things around whilst you're doing that particular task. So in the case of drawing, it's very much a case, and I'm quoting an old tutor of mine that was fantastic years and years ago. He used to say the eye sees and the hand reacts. He said the brain is very overrated in this process, that the brain is like the jockey on the horse. It's not making the running, it's not doing the jumping over fences. It's making some decisions about direction and possibly speed, but essentially it's along for the ride. And I really like that idea that it enables you to sometimes come away from the image while still working on it and be thinking, or sort of engage somewhere else, but then sort of coming back in, and obviously you come to points of the image where you think, there's something not quite right here, and then you've got to start working out logically what's going on. But yeah, essentially you're able to get to a point where the drawing is not completely automatic, but you're able to engage in a conversation with someone whilst you're making it. And I'm obviously asking lots of people, both at the hospital and generally people that I meet, to pose for me. And it's very much for tea and biscuits. When I made the decision that I no longer wanted to work from photograph, that left me with a problem that I needed models. I needed people to pose for me. I wanted my subject there in 3 dimensions for every stage of the image. And even though I was teaching life drawing at the time and I had a great roster of professional models, I couldn't quite afford them for my own work, because if a painting takes 30, 40 hours, that can really make it unaffordable for me. And I was at the time working at the University of London in their main students' union building, a building called ULU. And I was working there in the evenings, and quite often it was a quiet night, and I could spot one of the other members of staff, and I could say, "Why not come and sit for me for a little portrait?" I was working on the front desk, and I've got lots and lots of A6 moleskin sketchbooks, which are filled with portraits of the students that were working there. And I found that a really interesting demographic, because obviously the university pulled people from all over the globe to come and study incredible subjects. And it meant that I had access to this wonderful demographic, and I was there for a long time. It was a great part-time thing to have to support my artistic practice. It was an evening job. It was sociable. When I first started there, I was 23, so I was kind of like a peer of the student population, which stayed resolutely 19 to 26 on average, throughout my time there. But every year I got a year older. And sort of seeing these students coming every year, roughly a third of the university population graduating and leaving, and another third arriving as first years, and being there and seeing all these young people with all of this energy and positivity, and sort of, as I say, studying incredible subjects. Who knows what they're going to go on and do and be? And I felt like making portraits of them at that stage, which is an important stage in someone's life, first time away from home, first time perhaps studying the subject that you're going to go on and do as a career. I really felt as though I was painting and drawing their potential. But as I say, I could ask someone to pose for a quick drawing sometimes whilst we were both at the ULU building in the evening. And if they enjoyed that, I could invite them to my studio and say, let's make a larger drawing, let's make a colour drawing. And then as long as the studio was comfortable and professional and I've got good tea and coffee and nice music and some snacks, then I could maybe say, how about posing for a painting? Which, as I said, might be 30 or 40 hours, maybe 8 or 10 afternoons of posing. And it was just a fantastic way to work from life with a really interesting demographic.
It's probably the most British thing. We can do anything as long as there's tea and biscuits involved.
Yes, yeah, I guess. But I mean, obviously, people weren't always British. I had people pose for me who were from every background and nationality, and that was fascinating in itself. But yes, tea and biscuits is always a good lure for an artist studio, I think.
How many drawings and paintings do you think you've done now?
That's a difficult question. I don't keep a running total or running stock, and I've sold a lot over my career, so a lot of work has gone out to various people and places, and then I've got a lot in my studio, and some in my home. So there's an awful lot there. We're talking thousands. I mean, certainly in the case of drawings, it's many thousands. In the case of paintings, it's probably more like many hundreds. And that's slightly disappointing because, as I said, I think of myself as a painter. But some of the pressures of modern life sort of contract how much time you've got to spend with a brush in your hand. And that's something that I really wish I had more time in order to be painting particularly.
So of the many thousand people that have sat before you to be drawn or painted, if I had to ask you what your most memorable was, what would it be?
Gosh, that's...
The more people you meet in life, the more varied it can be, and you can have some absolute corkers. So I imagine if you've had basically, say, 5,000 one-on-one with people for over an hour, you must have had some experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's a great way of getting to know somebody making their portrait because, as I say, you chat whilst you're making the portrait. You allow the person to, sort of give some information about themselves if you don't already know them previously. And it's also quite an intimate thing. So making that eye contact for an extended period of time is something that we don't normally do with strangers. And it does make you feel close to people, sort of over the course of extended drawings and paintings. And I've had many people pose for me, and I'm trying to think. Obviously, when I go to certain places like the hospital, then I never know who I'm going to meet and draw that day, and the person might be, a world-class violinist or a senior person in business or another creative from the same or another discipline, and that's fascinating to meet people and talk to them about whatever it is that they're doing. And also we can talk about all kinds of subjects. Often, especially in the hospital, I let the patient lead with the conversation. So, it could be about their holidays or the book that they're reading or their cat or their dog or their kids. It could be anything. And then more generally, I think I did have the experience of drawing Ricky Gervais in his radio studio at XFM back in, when was this? 1998, I think it was. And that was kind of funny, trying to draw whilst a radio show was going on. And just having that kind of range of people, it's a unique experience with everybody that you draw. It can be quite in-depth or it could be quite surface according to how the person feels about, sort of like chatting or opening up. But you get to know people through the action of making an image of them.
So when you're sitting down with people, especially if they're halfway through treatment, you must encounter then firsthand a lot of human suffering. How are you able to not take that home with you at the end of the afternoon? Or is it a pretty joyous interaction that you have with them despite the treatment in which they're going through?
There are so many positive things happening in that situation that it can be often very uplifting. Obviously, when someone has a sad outcome following treatment or during treatment, then that can be really quite affecting emotionally. But generally, I find the atmosphere of that space and the wonderful clinical staff and support staff who are all doing everything they can to help the person, and the patient and their family, their loved ones, they're so sort of connected to the staff that treat them. They again form great, some great friendships, and um, no matter what the situation, no matter sort of if there has been delays to treatment or things like that, and this, I've never heard, you don't hear too much negative things at all, and people have different outcomes. One person that I met very early on in the process was one of the first people through the door of the new cancer hospital, and when she attended, she had a terminal diagnosis, and I've drawn her 3 times since then in that 10 years, and I
Wow.
saw her not that long ago. Um, so there are incredibly positive and uplifting things happening within that organization, within that environment, that yeah, help to offset the occasional times when you're affected by a sad outcome.
If we were to continue the slightly down thread, obviously you're studying quite close hand the fine line between life and death. What are your takeaways from a personal point of view, having encountered so many people on that journey?
I can't say that I'm experiencing that. I mean, that would again be the clinical staff who are absolutely amazing. But what I'm doing is I'm spending time with someone on that clinical journey, and it could be at any stage. It could be the first day that they're having treatment. It could be, sort of much further down the treatment cycles. I think that obviously you pick up from people that their priorities change, their focus sometimes changes. Sometimes they find that they have time for hobbies and activities that during their normal working life they've struggled to fit in, or they come back to, especially talking about creative hobbies, maybe coming back to something creative that's been almost stymied by the pace of life and family and work and so on, and suddenly finding themselves in a situation of having long-term treatments sometimes frees up lots of that time. But it certainly, I think, reorganizes people's priorities and what's important to them. And that's what I picked up anecdotally from several patients.
What strategy do you choose when drawing, say, a patient halfway through their treatment? Is it a case that you go for the hard truth, or do you take sort of artistic license in drawing them?
Well, as I said, the pencil on paper as a medium is quite well suited to the situation, and it's all about honesty. It's not, I'm not sitting in Leicester Square and sort of inviting people to pose for me and then asking them for a sum of money afterwards. This is a completely free thing. And my interest in it is in building a body of work that reflects the demographic of the people at the hospital, and that includes the staff and the patient's loved ones and families as well. The drawing has to react to circumstances. As I said, the patient's treatment is paramount. That's the primary thing. So if I say meet someone and we start the drawing and they're still to be connected to the IV, and sometimes I've set up the composition with the person with their hands together, perhaps in their lap, and then the chemo nurse will come along, the member of staff will come along and set them up with, blood pressure cuffs, and then the IV, and start the treatment going. And one arm might move out to the right hand side, which for the drawing composition is a little bit problematic. But you just got to roll with that change in circumstances, and the drawing has to reflect that. So sometimes there's a ghost image of the initial sketch of composition of where the hands were, and then maybe one hand or both hands move and you redraw them in the new location. But there's that history of the development of the drawing in there. And yeah, I think that makes the drawing more interesting and more sort of reflective of the circumstances of its making, which I think is, again, really interesting to put into an artwork. But I'm not trying to sort of make a particularly flattering image. I think I've got a very positive outlook and an optimistic outlook of other people, and I'm a fan of people. So the images that I'm producing are honestly how I see someone and reflective of the situation, whether it's in the hospital or elsewhere. But they're not trying to change. I'm not using artistic license. I think as well that going back to that idea of the eye sees, the hand reacts, there's not a lot of room in between that for, sort of a change of saying, well, I think actually you should be seeing something else. And that's one of the big things about working from life as well that develops. And when you're first starting out with drawing, quite often you're protective of the drawing as it is, and you've got to learn to accept that you've got to update that drawing, that you're not going to get it right first time, that you're going to have to compare the image mid-production against your subject and look for meaningful changes and updates. And that obviously gets you into a situation where, rather than looking for ways to flatter the subject, you're looking very much logically at, is this shape right? Is this angle right? Is this line right? And if not, then you've got to make those changes, which when you're sort of less experienced as an artist, it's quite daunting to do, because it also gives that feeling that by changing an image in one part, you're going to have to change it throughout, like knocking over a line of dominoes. But you've got to remember that, sort of like your knowledge of the subject has increased over the time that you've been working on the image by studying through drawing, and your hand and eye have got better coordinated during that time as well. So further on in the process, you're in a better position to say what's actually true, what's right, what some of the more complex areas of the composition or the image. You're in a better position to reproduce them in the artwork then.
And I suspect that process must have been very difficult during COVID. How did you manage that with the masks and the social distancing? Or did the whole, the portrait project, did it have to go on hold for a while?
Yeah, I mean, it became very quickly obvious at the beginning of 2020 that as a non-essential person in a clinical space, it was going to be a bad idea to continue to go in on a weekly basis to meet with patients. So I very quickly made the decision, let's suspend the project, because I didn't want to put anybody at risk. That's a big thing of going in. I'm still testing before I go to draw patients, and being careful generally, because it's an environment where it's obviously it's a clinical environment and a high risk clinical environment. So I suspended the visits to the hospital, and around the same time, the Arts and Heritage team at the hospital got in touch and asked if I could maybe make portraits by video call. And it's something I had tried out, sort of, it's an interesting mix between photography and from life, because the person is there and is posing, but we're using a camera like we are now during this chat to see one another. And it has some impositions on the composition. It turns everything from a portrait format to a landscape format for the image. But it's still quite an interesting thing to do, and I had tried it, so I said yes. And they asked, is it possible you could draw the staff by video call? And the hospital comms put it out as part of Arts and Heritage offer. All the different creative people working at the hospital came together under the banner of Creative Comfort, and we offered different activities and opportunities to the staff working. They always work tremendously hard, but obviously in the early stages of the pandemic and all the way through, it was kind of tireless. It was incredible to be around those staff doing that, and I had a fantastic response. So a lot of people from across the hospital, whether they were frontline clinical or support staff or admin, whether they were working from home or in the hospital itself, we made a lot of portraits using video calls during that first couple of waves of COVID, actually. It was nice to switch focus. I'd always wanted to include some of the members of staff in the collection of portraits that I was building at the hospital, but obviously they're much too busy to sit down and pose during work. So the opportunities with members of staff were always, sort of during long lunch breaks. They had them after work or on days off. So they were slightly different in feel. And yeah, doing the portraits by video call was an interesting addition to that.
Now, I've often wondered, and given that you're the debut artist on the show, it's almost a taboo topic in a way. I remember reading that being an artist is one of the hardest ways you can make your living because you're not only competing with all other artists currently living, but you're also competing against every other artist who's ever lived whose work still survives. I suspect it's just very difficult.
I think there's a reason that often in art history people are from comfortable backgrounds that can support them through the early years of being an artist. I've come from a slightly different angle to it, and it's the compulsion, the need I've got to sort of focus on this creative career that has meant that I've had to find a balance. So I've always had some sort of part-time work to keep the bank and the landlord happy. And for many years, that was, working at the University of London, as I said, the ULU building, and that was an evening job. So that meant I had every day free to paint and concentrate on my creative career, and then I'd go off at 6 p.m. and sort of do this job, which was quite a social job. There were lots of live music gigs and club nights and conferences and student clubs and societies at that building, and a really lively demographic, as I said, which I then managed to engage and include in the creative work that I was doing. So I kind of made my work part of that particular work environment, and I was there for 25 years at the University of London. And I actually did some work for the building too, because at one point the management of the building saw some of the smaller sketches I was doing of the students. I got interested in that demographic, as I say, and the oil on canvas paintings take 3 months. So I thought, how can I capture this demographic more efficiently? And obviously coming down in scale is one way to make the image quicker. And one of my roles on that front desk was to make the students' membership cards to the building, their ULU card. And often, so like the student would arrive and say, I'd like to get my ULU card, please. And I'd say, okay, I need your college ID and a photograph. And they'd look disappointed and say, oh, really, do you need a photograph? And I used to say, well, I could make your portrait, but it might take a while. And the joke obviously being that I could. And I started to think, okay, why don't I increase the number of portraits that I'm making, and I'll make them the same size as the student ID cards, which is like a credit card size. And that I can do a drawing like that in 15, 20 minutes. And then I decided I'd make 50 of those portraits. And I also then laminated them with a back copy, which was a facsimile of the ULU card itself. And I reduced the person's drawing to a passport photo size in order to fill the passport photo area. And I put the person's first name and their college, because that then gave you an idea of maybe where they were from and what they might be studying. And the management of the building saw that I was making these images and said, could you do something for us? And I said, yeah, absolutely. And they said, we don't have much money, but we could pay you a bit of a designer's fee. And they were talking about maybe blowing some of these portraits up to A4 or A3 and putting them in the various clipboards around the building for the conference signs. And I thought, no, that's not very good. So I gave them a proposal. Let's make 3 large-scale pieces of work based on these 50 portraits. And yeah, they went for it. And so I made 2 panels. They were both 8 foot by 4 foot in diameter, with a range of these 50 portraits within them. And what I'd done was I'd taken the drawings that I'd made from life, digitized them onto a computer, and then used a digital paint package, a graphics tablet and pen, to make them into digital paintings, which was an interesting learning curve. It was something that I hadn't really used before, to look at how the technology was trying to replicate the art materials that I'm normally using in the studio. So that was a really interesting process, and it resulted in the 2 large panels of color portraits together. And I also do another type of work where I take related images, reproduce them, and then cut them up into the same size as that sort of credit card size. And then I use those pieces to make another composition. And I did the same with the 50 portraits, to do a kind of laminate piece is what I call them, and they relate a little bit. I used to enjoy collage quite a lot when I was at college, and it's a little bit like that. not quite, but a similar kind of cutting up and moving around of elements of the images and mixing them. And yeah, the three pieces were at the Eula building. They went in to celebrate the 50th anniversary of the building being opened and that was in 2005, and they were there until the building sadly closed. In a modern world, it became a big piece of Bloomsbury property asset, the building, and ended up with the union being closed and the building being repurposed for other uses, which I thought was a great shame because it was a real sort of thriving place that brought people from all over the university. It was intercollegiate, and it had a strong sort of postgraduate and sort of people coming back after they've finished their studies to still engage in some of the clubs and activities that were going on in there. And I think it was a great resource. And unfortunately, when that closed, the pieces initially went into storage, and I've got them back now in my studio. I'm looking for a new home for those three pieces at some point.
So, Simon, I am an enthusiast in that I enjoy and cherish art, but I am by no means an artist. I don't think I've drawn anything since I was 5, and until this conversation, I don't think I was intending to until I was at least 70. But say I wanted to dip my toe into the murky world of art, where would you recommend that I start? What method, what medium? What do you think?
As I said, it's a practice discipline. So the first thing is to take all the pressure off yourself. This is a fun, relaxing, creative, expressive activity, and you can't really prejudge the outcome. So quite often, and going back to that wonderful tutor that I had many, many years ago, I remember visiting his house, and he used to draw on the walls in order to illustrate his point. And he was trying to tell me, he said, you're starting off from A and you're going towards B, which is the image in your head, the one that you want to produce. And then along the way, you run into all the problems of reproducing that image in your head. And you have to find ways to overcome them. You have to, sort of try different ways of working, different ways of looking, different ways of reacting to what you're seeing. And you come out at C, D, or E, all of which are much more interesting than the idea in your head of what you wanted to produce. And it's where you're making all those changes and decisions and overcoming of problems where the art, the interesting bit, happens. And I would say to anyone who, sort of like you said, maybe hasn't drawn since they were much younger or at school, or and has found that it's not become part of their life now, to absolutely give it a go. Absolutely. And remember how it was when you were a kid, how it was all about the materials, the feel of the materials, the fun of making those expressive marks, of describing what you were seeing or thinking about. And of course, when you're that young, you don't care about what other people think. But then at a certain stage in our sort of early adulthood, you start to get self-conscious about what someone else might think. And we start to get that sort of third-party ingrained idea that you have to be in some way particularly gifted or very good in order to make this activity worthwhile. And it's not. It's absolutely not. It's for everyone to enjoy, and it changes how you look at things in everyday life. If you're especially working from life, it really changes how you look at things just day to day, minute to minute. I think Ruskin had an interesting story about two people going for a walk on a summer's day, and he said one of whom draws and sketches from life regularly, the other has no interest in the topic. And he says that at the end of the walk, they both had markedly different experiences. Because we do, when we look, our brain is always trying to shortcut. Our brain is always trying to say, I know all about that. And it's almost saying, let me tell you what I think you should be seeing. And when you then start to confront that with creative activity and looking at your subject and looking at your image, you sometimes realize how much your brain is saying, oh, I know all about eyes or hands or whatever it is that you're drawing. Let me tell you what I think you should be seeing. And you start to look then at what's actually there, and you start to stop that process happening on an every moment, every day kind of basis. And I think that's really interesting and valuable for anybody, really. And as I said, nearer the beginning, that it becomes a bit of a rabbit hole. You can really pursue this, and that's why people get so into and so connected that they would pursue a creative career when it's not immediate that it's going to be a financial reward, that it's going to be a uh, a, a commercially positive thing to do. I mean, just the act of having everyone that I asked to pose for a portrait, just having them look back at me, is anti-commercial in a sense. People don't often buy portraits of people they don't know, and they certainly are less likely to if that person is on the wall staring right back at them every minute. So by doing the sort of work that I'm doing, I'm almost shooting myself in the foot commercially, but I don't care. That's the image that I want. That's the connection that I want. That's the experience I want to pass along, and the image that I want to create, and the effect of that image on subsequent viewers. And everything else goes by the by. The idea that am I going to be able to sell this immediately goes out of the window, because it's just about you and the work. And if you're coming from it from a non-professional standpoint, you don't have to think about putting this online. You don't have to post it in an exhibition and display it. It's very much something that you can do in a sketchbook or in a small and private way, and you can put it away and nobody has to see it if you don't want to, but the activity is still valuable.
Amazing. Right, I'm off to go buy some paper and pencils. What a manifesto.
You're very
Simon,
welcome.
thank you so much. It's been amazing to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you.